Got a big episode today, a lot to talk about on today's show. First off, asking my guests if think tanks are in control in Washington, even with Donald Trump in the White House, breaking down the latest updates on Trump's Ukraine policy and Trump and Netanyahu's supposed cakewalk in Gaza, and also Israel's self defense. So I want to start off, Jose, with this article, the latest one that you wrote at antiwar.com, where, of course, you are a writer. And just to introduce you to our audience, Jose Niño is a freelance writer. He's the headline at Headline News, along with Ken Silva, who's been previous guest of the show. Jose is the deputy editor. You can subscribe to his Substack newsletter by visiting Jose Niño Unfiltered on Substack.com. So, Jose, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, man.
Happy to have you here. A lot to talk about. Starting off again with this latest article you wrote for the Institute, Corporate Interests and Think Tanks Dictate U.S. Foreign Policy. And Jose, I think had you wrote this under the Biden administration, the reaction would have been, of course, right? Joe Biden was a return to the establishment after 4 years of Donald Trump. But in the Trump administration, you say that it's these think tanks that are still largely dominating. So kind of break down what you wrote there and why you wrote it.
So, this idea is actually not a thing that I conjured up. I actually largely took it from the geopolitical analyst and YouTuber Brian Berletic. He talked about continuity of agenda, this concept where there's a permanent bureaucracy and also nonprofit industrial complex in DC that ultimately writes all the policies at least like 5 to 15 years in advance, and all the policy options they talk about, whether it's sanctions, military action, covert operations, and all other forms of geopolitical skullduggery. That stuff is outlined in these think tank papers, and then they are passed on to staff and eventually politicians. And most of these politicians, having worked in lobbying myself, have very little agency, and they're easy to influence, buy off, and eventually indoctrinate with these type of policy papers and pressure. And what Berletic mentioned is he put into words what I've always assumed in analyzing geopolitical affairs, but he was able to concretize it very well. And I wanted to like reinforce this point because no matter who's in office, you're going to get John McCain, to paraphrase Tom Woods. And there's a reason why you get that. It's not just something that happens out of the ether, it's the product of this consortium of nonprofits, think tanks, pressure groups, the defense industry, politicians that ensures a permanent geopolitical, like interventionist agenda that you will see executed regardless of who's in office. And Trump is no different. There's nothing magical about the Trump administration, no matter how hard he brands himself as a populist or this pseudo Buchananite figure. He is very much continuing a lot of the regime's agenda. And just because they're not going to war or using direct military action doesn't mean that the US has abandoned its goal for geopolitical primacy. It has tons of tools, from sanctions, covert operations, and the use of alliance structures to continue to antagonize great power rivals ranging from China, Russia, even other bugaboos like Iran.
In your article for the Institute, one of the organizations that you really highlight is Heritage. And so, do you see this as being the one that, as things ebb and flow, there's different think tanks and these organizations in Washington, D.C. And so, do you think Heritage has a particularly large influence over the Trump administration at this time?
Yeah, I'd say it's one of the biggest. I mean, they've been a pillar of conservative for national security decision making since they were created. I believe that was in the late 70s or early 80s. And regardless of what Republican is in office, they're going to have an outsized influence. And they're they've also have calibrated their message, and I think that there's a cynicism to it because um everybody knows that direct kinetic military action is very unpopular. And as a result, the Republican Party will pay this whole lip service about ending never-ending wars, but they stop there. Like they don't talk about sanctions, covert operations, and other forms of like containment that that the U.S. uses, whether it's through the EU, NATO, or the creation of an Arab NATO, such as like the Abraham Accords, which I see as like the first step that Trump talked about in his first term. These are all mechanisms and tools that are talked about in these policy papers. And Trump, in many respects, is continuing this. And contrary to his rhetoric, his record does show that he still believes in American primacy, where where countries like Russia, China, and Iran have to bow down to U.S. interests, and countries like especially Russia, which they talk about normalizing relationships with, which is really a euphemism for we're going to use you, we're going to stop tensions with you, but you have to like bow down to us and become our little geopolitical plaything to use against China. So in effect, like the U.S. is still continuing its hegemonic agenda, but it's got a different face to it, and several different tools are being used, but it's still like the same imperial agenda that threatens world stability and does not serve the interests of the American nation.
All right. So, kind of my last question on this subject and where I want to take the conversation is how do you message this to people? Because, at times, as you point out, that they actually signal these policies in advance. Say, for example, in 2019, RAM released a study on how to weaken and destabilize Russia. And it shows all those things that the United States did between really 2014, but up until 2022, when they ultimately provoked Russia to invade Ukraine. And when you bring this up to people as what should be conclusive evidence that yes, the war in Ukraine was provoked, their eyes kind of glaze over, and you're talking about people and organizations they really haven't heard of. And it almost sounds conspiratorial. It almost sounds like this has to be made up. It has to be some kind of lie, right? Because that it just doesn't sound true that these people working in these think tanks are really crafting policy, especially when Donald Trump is in office, the supposed wild card, right? The guy who could really mix it up and change policy.
I would say the most basic way to get people to change their thinking here is to take the very simple step of watch what politicians do, not what they say. Specifically, watch like the moves they're making, and that's oftentimes covered in alternative media. And look at who's funding them, and look at who Trump is appointing as well. I would say is very important because those are the strongest predictors of political behavior. And this is something I've learned to working in legislative halls, where you have to look at what these politicians are doing, not just behind the scenes, but also in terms of like the committee assignments they receive, and also the people that they have on their staff, and who they appoint in their cabinets and all of that. You need to look at that, or at least listen to a influencer or commentator that's keeping tabs on that, because if only you look at like headlines from the corporate media and look at what politicians saying, you're only scratching the surface, and at times it can be a total ruse or fabrication as well. So you have to look at like the moves, not the rhetoric.
Well, that is really a perfect segue to our next conversation, because if you're watching the corporate press, if you're listening to the mainstream media, you would think that Donald Trump is just about to sign the rights of all of Ukraine over to Vladimir Putin and then wash Vladimir Putin's feet on public TV. And yet, the actual policy, what we're actually hearing, sounds far more aggressive. So, first off, I have this clip of the new German leader Mertz explaining what the policy is as far as sending long range weapons and then being used inside Russia. So let's play this first clip.
There are no longer any range restrictions on weapons delivered to Ukraine, neither from the British, nor the French, nor from us, nor from the Americans. This means that Ukraine can now also defend itself, including, for example, by taking action such as attacking military positions located within Russia or by targeting other strategic sites as necessary. Until recently, it was not able to do that. Until recently, with very few exceptions, it also did not do that. Now it can. In jargon, we call this long-range fire, meaning equipping Ukraine with weapons that can attack military targets in the rear. And this is the crucial qualitative difference in Ukraine's conduct of the war. Russia attacks civilian targets completely ruthlessly, bombing cities, kindergartens, hospitals, and nursing homes. Ukraine does not do that. And we place great importance on ensuring that it stays that way. But a country that can only confront an aggressor on its own territory is not defending itself adequately. And this defense of Ukraine is now also taking place against military infrastructure on Russian territory.
From that is looking at what the Trump policy supposedly is. If you look at the mainstream media, this seems to be an expansion of the Biden administration policy. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was one of the few people, and I was saying this back in November, December, like, do not expect Trump's promise of ending the conflict in Ukraine to take place within 24 hours. And I just cited effectively like his sanctions policies, the attacks on Wagner mercenaries, his withdrawal from the INF, and anti-ballistic missile treaties from his first administration, among other policies against Russia, that points out that Trump is no non-interventionist, much less a dove on the issue of Russia. He's willing to negotiate with Russia if they kowtow. But if they don't kowtow, you can fully expect potentially more disbursements of aid, and also outsourcing the proxy war functions to the EU and NATO, because most of these EU countries are ratcheting up their spending to accommodate the US's demands that they meet the NATO 2% GDP benchmarks for defense spending. But that's really just a grift for the US defense industry to make a huge buck off, because most of these countries in Europe, their military industrial complexes are highly interconnected to the US, and the US wants to maintain its like dominant position as the key supplier of US made armaments to Europe, and they ultimately don't want Europe to have an indigenous military industrial complex. So all this talk about Trump leaving NATO and all this, there's very little evidence to show that for that. And if anything, he's trying to like increase defense spending among NATO countries, despite like whatever geopolitical priorities countries have, like, because it's pretty ridiculous to be demanding a country like Spain, that's thousands of miles away from Russia, to be implementing policies to increase defense spending, which have benefits the U.S. defense industry. It's all starts to make sense, and there's very little evidence, as I mentioned, that Trump wants to undo much of it. If anything, he's just recalibrating it.
Right. That does seem to be the case. And this next clip, Trump gives some of his latest thoughts on the war in Ukraine, where there seems to be some serious escalations from the Ukrainian side that Trump either isn't aware of or apparently doesn't understand why they're affecting Russian policy. So let's play this next clip from Donald Trump.
Yeah, I'll give you an update. I'm not happy with what Putin's doing. He's killing a lot of people, and I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay? We're in the middle of talking, and he's shooting rockets into Kiev and other cities. I don't like it at all.
President, what do you want to do about that?
I'm surprised. I'm very surprised. We'll see what we're going to do. What am I going to tell you? You're the fake news, aren't you? You're totally fake. All right, any other questions? I don't like what Putin is doing, not even a little bit. He's killing people. And something happened to this guy, and I don't like it.
Can I follow up on that? A Russian commander reportedly said that Putin was almost caught in the middle of a drone attack from Ukraine. So do you have any?
I haven't heard that, but maybe that would be a reason. I don't know, but I have not heard that.
All right. So, Jose, I mean, we just saw Trump say this really absurd thing, but I want your take on it. And particularly, do you really think that Trump didn't know that the Ukrainians got pretty close, it sounds like, to assassinating Vladimir Putin, and they didn't think that this would be the cause for Russia to really ramp up attacks on Ukraine?
I mean, who knows? I think you have to look at Trump as a performer, not a reformer, as one friend of mine put it. Because, like, the idea of the US trying to mediate a conflict between Russia and Ukraine is laughable because of the fact that the US is still providing intelligence and military aid to Ukraine. That let's just clarify that. And also, by continuing to give aid and intelligence to Ukraine, you could easily see rogue elements of the Ukrainian government perform these type of risky operations, like trying to allegedly assassinate Vladimir Putin. And perhaps Trump didn't know about this, but here's the thing: that's the risk you run when you continue to supply military aid and provide intelligence and other forms of assistance to the Ukrainians. And this whole conflict, though, there's actually a pretty straightforward solution to ending it. Is if the US just stops sending military aid, stops cooperating with Ukraine, and basically turning it into a de facto NATO state. But and also stop trying to use Europe as a potential forward base against this. Like, if the Europeans want to do it on their own, that's fine, knock themselves out. But for the US, there's no interest in continuing this conflict. And the issue, I think, ultimately is Trump, like most people in the political class, they still have the American primacy mindset. So they're not gonna, it's gonna be very hard for them to take the proverbial L, take this loss, and end the military aid. Because by then, Ukraine will collapse and there will be hundreds of billions of dollars of aid, economic and military, just going down the drain in this geopolitical quagmire. But that's where we're at right now, and I don't really see much evidence that Trump will rip the band-aid off and just say that this is a failed project.
Well, Jose, I have to give you credit because early in the Trump administration, you wrote this article for the Libertarian Institute. What will a second Trump term mean for U.S. or Russian American relations? And your first sentence in that article is: contrary to the conventional wisdom permeating across alternative media, a second Trump administration is likely going to be much more hawkish than expected. And so I'm wondering if there were particular signs, particularly who he put into his administration, that you saw that were big red flags that made you think that, hey, this guy actually isn't going to be able to do anything particularly positive, and even when it comes to Russia.
For one, Marco Rubio, who's a consummate neoconservative hawk, and then the erstwhile national security advisor Mike Waltz, who's another hawk. But I think there's also, beyond the staffing, there is like a structural thing where aspect to this where the interventionist NGO complex is still powerful. These lobbies still elect close to super majorities of Republicans and Democrats that favor the US being a global hegemonic power. It is this structure, this revolving door, if you will, that creates this conveyor belt of interventionist politicians and staffers that are going to be all over the halls of Congress and slithering their way into the executive branch. And the result is more of the same, regardless of what the voters decide every 4 years in November. And to me, that's what explains a lot of this institutional inertia, if you will, because it's really a ruling class problem.
on to our next subject and just remind people to share the show. We have a few hundred people listening live right now on It's a pretty good audience, and also quite a few people watching on other platforms. If you'd like to leave us a comment or recommend future guests for the show, head on over to our YouTube page. I do have the link underneath the post on the live stream on It's, so it's very easy to find, and subscribe to the channel while you're there. Now, Jose, I want to ask you about another prediction that you made at the beginning of the Trump administration, which is the mass expulsion of Palestinians will not be a cakewalk. And of course, this cakewalk is a reference to the war in Iraq, and so it may be a similar cakewalk to the one, in Iraq that the U.S. ended up in, which wasn't a cakewalk at all. So, it does seem that Israel is moving ahead with this policy. The Trump administration is completely signed on to this policy. Why do you think that this attempt to expel the Palestinians from Gaza is not going to go very well for the Israelis and their American backers?
So you have to look at the Gaza conflict is, I think, right now the most prolonged military conflict that Israel has actually involved has been like involved in recent memory, if not its entire history. And it's actually turning into a quagmire because of the fact that Israel still has not reached like a political solution to this issue, because they can bomb Gaza, they can decapitate the leadership of Hezbollah and all of this, but they still have Israel's still surrounded by enemies. And also um Israel before this entire conflict was almost in a state of civil war because of like just the demographic shifts that have occurred in Israeli society, where the country has become much more religious and nationalistic, owing to the fact that it's much more Sephardic and Mizrahi, Middle Eastern Jewish extraction. And that's creating a lot of rifts in Israeli society. And while the Gaza conflict has kind of patch together those tensions, they're starting to these tensions are starting to manifest themselves in different forms with the increase of casualties among the Israeli soldiers, where the Israeli public is frankly quite genocidal, but when it comes to the policies they want to implement in Gaza, but they are very averse to casualties. And if this conflict continues to drag on, and these reports that Hamas is like actually militarily reconstituting itself and it's not actually being targeted as much, you just have a more prolonged conflict where with increased casualties that could turn into a political crisis for Israel, especially if they waste so much blood and treasure shutting down their economy and diplomatically isolating themselves, that you could see a breakdown of the Israeli state, because you have to look at Israel not just from like the military dimension, but also domestic pressures that the country is facing, where we could be on the verge of seeing a institutional collapse there. And that's why I don't think, for example, that this is going to be some like anything that Trump is proposing or that the Israeli government is proposing is going to be a magical solution. Because first off, relocating a million or 2 million Palestinians, there's not going to be many countries that are going to be takers in the Middle East. That's going to create a potential fifth column in those countries where they would probably launch reprisals against Israel, or even in the case of countries like Egypt or Jordan, could actually topple those governments and create an even more hostile government against Israel. And with regards to Western countries, I mean, immigration restriction sentiment is very high across the West, and bringing in that many people, that's just not going to sit well. And it's just it looks like a quagmire all around. And I don't think there's very many solutions that are going to be easy for Israel to implement.
Well, Jose, as much as I want to agree with you on that point that Israel will find themselves in a real quagmire here, it does appear that they are getting very comfortable with the idea of just starving people to death. which I mean, I'm very worried that they are able to complete this genocide. But I want to move on. I have one last topic I want to get your thoughts on today. Netanyahu has made some pretty absurd statements in the past, but these are the ones he's making now are close to, just the height of hubris and absurdity. So let's play this clip from Benjamin Netanyahu.
The protesters themselves, many of them don't even know what they're chanting. When they're chanting Free Palestine, they're saying, really, destroy Israel, destroy the Jews. It's the modern equivalent of Heil Hitler. That's what it says. When they say from the river to the sea is a few kilometers here, and the river is a few kilometers there. It means the end of Israel. That's what they're chanting. So they bought the demonization. They bought the vilification of the one democracy that is fighting a just war with just means. And here's what happens when this spreads and it goes to the ICC. The ICC, the court that was supposed to establish really after the Holocaust in order to prevent another Holocaust, and the ICC declares that I, and former defense minister, effectively the state of Israel, they'll issue more decrees, we're the war criminals. What does it say to democracies? What does it say to free societies? It imperils your right of self-defense. It means that this tactic of implanting yourself in a civilian population while sending rockets and murderers to murder civilians, as you hide behind your own civilians, you are given effective immunity. And once this idea is implanted, it will spread and spread and spread. And spread to your own societies. So for the future of civilization, we can't have that.
So, Jose, really final, I guess, questions and thoughts here on this statement from Netanyahu. Is Israel acting in self-defense in Gaza? Because this is what Israel is using to justify what they're doing, to sell it particularly to the American public, that this is self-defense. This is about the survival of Israel and the Jewish state. And if we don't continue, in what we're doing, then we're putting ourselves in jeopardy.
Oh no, it's just the latest in the operations that Israel has created since its foundation, and it's just the latest mutation, if you will, where it's a Jewish supremacist state, and that's been like institutionalized through this hard right coalition that Netanyahu's been able to cobble together. They're using whatever pretext possible because they see it as their land. They want their as you said, they're pretty much the only option they now have is pretty much just genociding the population. This is not self-defense or even disproportionate I meant to say proportionate like response to like Hamas attacks. It's clearly designed to destroy the Palestinian people and destroy any ability they have to like form a coherent political entity. And I'd also note too, even in Israeli media, they've conceded that Israeli troops are not hitting a lot of military targets, like Hamas targets. They're just like flat out killing people. And this is a live stream genocide. And it is kind of like the end goal because if they can't displace Palestinians, they're just going to have to like either kill them through conventional military means or, as you said, starve them because that's the like Israel is like the id of this Jewish supremacist vision where they want to dominate all of Israel and potentially even create a greater Israel that's in line with the Old Testament. And that's what you get when you have when you have like this fanatical government that has control, that is now in control of Israel.
Government would go. And again, this is the Israeli government doing it, but it is largely enabled by the United States of America, our government.
100%. Yes.
We could really shut it off if we wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jose, thank you so much for coming on the Kyle Anzalone Show today. I really appreciate it. Everybody, I can't recommend enough checking out Jose's work. Of course, he's one of our writers at the Libertarian Institute, deputy editor at Headline News, a very good news source. And of course, check out his Substack, José Niño Unfiltered. Jose, thanks for coming on the show. We'll have to do it again soon.
Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Before you check out, share the show wherever you're watching it. And of course, head on over to our YouTube channel and subscribe. As this channel grows, we plan to do more with it. And so the more subscribers we have, the faster we're going to build. So help us in that mission and to deliver more truth and more news on this channel. We'll be back with another episode on Monday, 4:45 Eastern Time. I have a really exciting interview lined up that I'm very happy to bring you. And so you definitely want to subscribe to the show because you're not going to want to miss our next episode. Thanks, everyone.